I'd like to welcome you to the place. This is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and scriptural honesty, whatever that means. I don't think that we're completely honest yet. We're simply working towards that kind of modeling. With that said, tonight we have, in my estimation, possibly one of the best shows ever. We're starting a little bit late, but that's the way that we work around here. But my point is, we have various people here. Number one, we have Sarah Morehead, and she is a very, very powerful person doing a wonderful work that is from this particular kind of entity called Recovering from Religion. And my wife and I have been discussing her all week, and the last time that we saw her actually with Bob Graves and Greg Bray, we were just astounded at her honesty, her integrity, and the way that she really articulated what she thought needed to be done. It was really powerful. We also have someone with us tonight. He's behind me, by the way. His name is Vince Laria, and he's an artist. He's a brilliant person. He likes to paint, get messy, and all of that. And so he's going to be in the background for a long, long time, possibly, redoing the set, painting pictures, and just being creative. And so we're not simply academic around here. We enjoy different forms of art. We like to have different kinds of conversations. So with that said, I don't want to hesitate from getting Sarah on board here, but I do want to introduce two people who are actually panelists tonight. I'm not going to call them guests. They show up, and they are wonderful people. They are from the Pensacola area, and that would be Michael Fulford and also Sean. Welcome, Michael and Sean.
Thank you. Thank you.
You guys really do a lot for us. I mean, you guys coming around with your friends and people who have minds like you guys, this is why things are moving forward, and I just want to say thank you. My wife and I do.
Right. I mean, they're actually a part of us. That's the way I feel.
I do too.
What about you?
I think so. I think they have the ability to grasp that this is much greater than just talking about theism and atheism. It's like moving beyond both of them in a sense.
Sure.
And so they are powerful individuals. Well, let's get down to business tonight, and let's talk with Sarah for a few minutes. Sarah, say something to our audience.
Well, first, thank you. That was an incredible welcome. I really appreciate your words. That was really cool. It sounds like you guys have really looked into what I'm doing and what the organization is about. I really appreciate that. Very glad to be here tonight. Really looking forward to our conversation.
I want to jump right into something because something that my wife and I have talked about a lot is your journey. Mm-hmm. And I think that sometimes in order to move theists especially, they need to listen to why you walked away from theism. And I think that you were actually a Southern Baptist, is that correct?
That is correct. I identify it as an evangelical Southern Baptist. I was born and raised into that belief system and followed it the vast majority of my life. I was very devoted.
When did you actually get saved?
Well, and now the term saved is obviously a little bit relative. But I was, I want to say it was elementary school. I think it was Vacation Bible School. The pretty typical, they get everybody all worked up and everybody comes to the front and that's the way it goes. And that's just what you do. And you do it along with everyone else. And it's supposed to be this great personal enlightening experience. So, I had a lot of questions at the time that didn't quite add up. But everybody said, once you do this, it's all good from there. You're set, and so I did what I was supposed to do.
Yeah, I was subjugated into getting saved when I was 4 years old. I was a wicked person. without God, going to hell and all of that. And so I had to repent and all of that at the age of 4. And do you think it's abusive to children to be presented with the idea of getting saved, that is, with the context of hell?
Absolutely. I think in any other context outside of religion, that message, when you take it literally, which is what these religious people do, that message is extremely damaging, and people would be arrested for child abuse if they sat a child down and said, unless you do what I want right this minute, then in a few years, I'm going to put you in a fire and I'm going to burn you. Now, when we say it from a religious perspective, everybody just nods and says, oh, okay, that's completely acceptable. But if you take it outside of the supernatural and say, okay, we're going to literally say this and we're going to promise to follow through, that would be seen as abusive behavior. So because their constant message is it's a literal interpretation, this is actually what is going to happen, then by default, if that's actually what's going to happen, yes, that's an abusive thing to tell children, without question.
We have some T-shirts around here, and on the front of them, it says, teaching hell is child abuse. If we sent you one, would you wear it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's wonderful. I want to find out why did you change? What caused this paradigm shift in your life? You were a Southern Baptist, and I think that you heard some other doctrine of some kind, and you started agreeing with different kinds of theology at first. Is that correct?
Well, at first, honestly, I was just terrified because there came a point in my life where it just stopped making sense. I had literally devoted my entire life to the church and to following what my pastor had led us to believe, what the junior pastors taught, what the deacons taught, what the Bible school teachers taught, what the adult Sunday school leader and the women's studies, and I mean you're in church constantly to continually refresh that mentality and not to allow any other information in. And when it all started to fall away, it was not a light switch. I try to explain that to people from my experience and the experience of many people I've talked to. It was much more like a dimmer switch. There was not a moment that I remember where I woke up and said, I don't believe any of this anymore. And I think I said this on Greg's show as well, but I don't remember the moment that I became an atheist. I remember the moment that I considered the possibility that American Baptists might not go to hell. I wasn't even sure on that. I just thought there was a possibility that they could be saved as well, that their claim to salvation was just as valid as mine. And that was groundbreaking.
Yeah.
And at that point, I hadn't really done a lot of reading. I had no idea who Dawkins or Hitchens or any of these people were in the secular movement. Secular was such an evil, scary, horrible word at the time. I just knew that it wasn't quite adding up anymore. I knew that my own experience, I could not have possibly done more in the lines of what God had asked of me, in my opinion. And everything was getting more and more miserable. And then in the face of that, the only people who accepted me and my family and were there for us through all of these very difficult times were people who, by definition of my church, were defined by as Satanists. Now, they weren't Satanists. I didn't, at the time, couldn't discern between, paganism and, anything else outside of you're either Southern Baptist or you're going to hell. It was very black and white. But these people were very kind and very loving, and they were there for me and my kids. And that was the first experience I'd had really with people outside of my belief system. And they weren't scary, horrible people. Imagine that.
Do you feel like after all of these years and with what you're doing right now, do you feel from time to time that you're still waking up?
I do. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is I'm a firm believer that we spend our life learning. So no matter what, if you are reading and studying and researching and all those things, you're just always going to be more awakened to the world around you. I firmly believe that. But two is because of the isolation that fundamentalism encourages. there are still things that I learn, and I find out that the vast majority of the world actually already knew that, but I hadn't figured it out yet. I hadn't learned that yet. And some of that is because, I grew up in the South, and very, very Christian schools. Even though they were public schools, they were very, very Christian schools, things like that. So my education on some level was lacking all over the place. I'm still trying to fill in those blanks everywhere. But it's always an exciting process to learn and just keep exploring.
I have a friend of mine who is actually a superintendent of a school system, and he told me several years ago, he said that he was trying to do everything that he could possibly do to turn all of these schools that he was over into Christian schools.
Mm-hmm.
And he later reported that he had done so. And he had done so by actually hiring Christians, people who believe like he did or does.
Mm-hmm.
And his agenda was to make sure that all of these people in his county would get saved.
Mm-hmm.
How does that make you feel these days when you hear reports like that?
Honestly, the first thought I went back to was remembering my pastor preaching to us, Sunday after Sunday, about how the way to win the world to Christ is through the secular system. And for people to befriend your superintendent and befriend your representatives and befriend, your teachers and things like that, and make sure they know where to find their Christian resources and how to subtly bring children to Christ, without setting off the red flags and without breaking laws and things like that. I mean, they're very careful about how they do that, but it happens. It's happening now. How do I feel about it? It saddens me, but I'm not surprised. I mean, I absolutely know that's happening. I think sometimes people lose focus of how current this is occurring. How right now this is happening. People hear about this stuff and you think, oh, that was back during the Jimmy Swaggart era and things like that in the 80s. And it's not. This is going on right now in what appear to be mainstream churches all across the country. They're teaching this doctrine, and they're telling people to infiltrate and go into the secular components to move the entire, government, local, national, everything towards a more religious viewpoint, fundamentalist viewpoint.
You moved along in your journey. What gave you the ability or gave you the courage to question the Bible?
I hesitate to call it courage, honestly. It came down to it couldn't be possible. When I was a single mom, I had left a very violent and abusive marriage. It was a Promise Keepers marriage. I was a very devout Christian wife. I thought my husband was a devout Christian husband, all those things. And that all fell apart. And when it did, that started the process of me, the first thing I did was not reject everything I'd been taught. The first thing I did was hunker down and dive into it even more. Because obviously everything I had been taught is when it's not working, it's because you're not working. It's not because the doctrine doesn't work. And so the courage, like I said, I don't know that was the word initially, because it was just more desperation of, I felt like I prayed without ceasing. I felt like I gave my willpower to God, and all of those wonderful catchphrases that they drill into you, that you lean on. When that stops working, and when your church turns you away and says that you are not worthy of their help and their support and all those things, and the only people who are willing to be there for you are the very people who your church has told you your entire life are worthless and going to burn in hell, at some point that begins to outweigh all the doctrine that has been shoved into your brain. And that's what it comes down to.
Now that you've realized, that the Bible isn't completely true, if any of it, that is in your mindset, have you been able to share with your children a much better model of life?
I think so. My older children were raised very, very Christian, very fundamentalist. I have since apologized to them. They're great kids, and I think I did pretty well with them. But I did at one point just really take responsibility and say, I taught you this because that's what I thought was right, and here's why I was wrong. My younger kids have never had that experience. And back to that world just opening up, when you don't restrict yourself within the confines of fundamentalism and even faith in general, in my opinion, the sky is the limit as to what you can teach your kids and what you can teach them to rely on. You can teach them to use their own common sense, to use logic, to use reason, to use compassion without compassion being contingent upon some arbitrary doctrine that says, you only are this kind in this circumstance. And then after this line is crossed, they're no longer, worthy of your kindness and your generosity. I love that there's no restrictions to that in their life anymore. And it's incredibly freeing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. If you could stand in every pulpit that is of the Southern Baptist movement that you were a part of, what would you say?
First of all, she wouldn't be allowed to stand in the pulpit.
Well, I understand that.
Excellent point. Excellent point.
I'm going to get crucified. They haven't accepted women yet. I mean, come on, they're in the back of the bus. Now, if you could stand in the back of the bus and actually say something at a Baptist church, maybe that's a better way of putting it. What would you say? What would you want to say to all of those people who are stuck in the Southern Baptist movement, if you will?
The first thing I would want them to hear, and I don't know that it would register right that minute, but the first thing I would want them to hear is that you are good enough. Because the one thing, whether it's Southern Baptists or, Mormon or any sort of, literal doctrine, a belief system, the one thing they start with is you are not good enough without this package of salvation. Whatever their package is, however they wrap it up, you're not good enough until you accept that and participate in that. And that would be the message I want them to hear. You are good enough the way you are, all of your faults, all of your flaws, and probably, if they would let me stand there long enough to tell them that the things that they think are flaws aren't necessarily so. The religion does a really good job of teaching people to find fault with things that truly aren't really that harmful. They harm no one. It's back to, just trying to get everybody to conform and getting everybody to follow a certain line of thought. You have to reject anything that doesn't fit that mold. And I would want these people to know that they're unique and wonderful individuals, and they don't have to be restricted by this to be okay.
What do you think that if you would have heard a message of acceptance early on, or as you were going through a transition, do you think you would have gone from theist to atheist, or would you have had an intermediate stop there in the middle if you would have heard a positive acceptance?
That's a great question. I actually did go through stages, and one of the things I've developed with recovering from religion is what I call the spectrum of disbelief. And it's something, after talking to hundreds of people, it seems to be a fairly common progression through religious belief systems. And it's very similar to what I did. I think some people kind of jump around and things like that. But as far as if I had heard a message of acceptance initially, like I said, the only place that I heard that message was from people who were already condemned to hell, as far as I was concerned. But I rejected it initially for a very long time. I remember praying and asking God why he was sending Satanists to me to help my family. I mean, they were bringing me casseroles. I prayed over the casseroles because obviously they were contaminated by Satan, but it's really nice of them to bring casseroles. I mean, there was such a disconnect in that logic.
Right.
But it was so confusing to me. These wonderful, caring people. It was these two men who I originally assumed were just roommates. Turned out I was very wrong about that. but they were just so kind and so wonderful. And they accepted me and my family for who we were and for our situation. No strings attached, no nothing. And they answered questions when I had them, and I had lots of them. They were very patient about it. And they didn't push their belief system, nor did they reject mine. I mean, I would say, but you realize because you don't believe this, that means you're going to hell. And they would just kind of smile and drink their coffee and keep the conversation going. So, I did hear a message of acceptance early on. And initially I rejected it. And I think, I see that when I interact with people who identify as more, inerrant word believers. Most religious fundamentalists don't identify with the word fundamentalism, I've learned. Now that I'm outside of it, I use it a lot more frequently, but I don't think as many people inside that thought process tend to identify that way. But when I talk to them, and I point these things out to them about you're okay just the way you are, and you're not broken, and you don't need salvation, those things don't resonate at that moment, and I don't expect them to. But we all know, all of us who have come from any sort of devout faith, we all know that those doubts exist. It's just that we're taught to ignore them. We're taught to put them on the shelf. We're taught to find very hollow answers for those questions. So by validating them and helping them along that process, I hope that when those doubts become too much, they'll remember what I said, and hopefully it'll help.
When I rejected my salvation many years ago, that is, that God saved me as a 4-year-old, and I rejected the premise that Jesus died for my sins. I even rejected all of the atonement theories, propitiation, etc., and I'd said, this is nonsense. People didn't smile. They reacted in various ways. Mostly they were very unkind, polemic, etc. And so my question is, how did people treat you when you rejected this idea of salvation?
Well, my first step was just simply not going to that church anymore. And that was before I had even rejected the concept. I still identified as a Southern Baptist. I just knew that particular church wasn't going to be there for our family. What had happened was my ex-husband was extremely violent and abusive. And he had been towards me for quite some time. But at one point he started going after the kids, and for whatever reason, whatever arbitrary, ridiculous reason, that was the line in the sand for me. And my church, which was, a prominent mega church, they knew that sort of thing was going on in their congregation, and there was much wink, wink, nudge, nudging going on about how to correct your wife, and if she just does what she's told, then we don't have to worry about it, do we? And that sort of thing. So when it crossed the line and he went after my kids, that was it for me. And I went to my church and I said, I had to meet with the deacons, because I had asked my husband to leave. I didn't actually want a divorce at that point. I just wanted him to go get some anger counseling and try to get better and come back. Because of course we, gotta stay married. So I went to my church and I met with the benevolence committee, which is a panel of 12 men, which is extremely intimidating for a woman in an abusive situation, even more so. And I told them the situation, and I asked them for about $600 to pay the rent and keep the lights on and that sort of thing. And they said they had to pray about it. So left, I had to come back like a week later, and came back to the meeting, and they said they had prayed about it, and Jesus had told them, or had not led them to provide me with that assistance, and instead had encouraged me to study the verses in the Bible that remind me how to be a dutiful wife. So as I was leaving, and I'm in tears and I'm heartbroken and all those things, I'm leaving, and I go to push the door out, and I wasn't paying attention because I was so upset. And I pushed the door into a gentleman who was actually putting glass etching on the doors. And picture a massive mega church. I mean, this is huge, and they're etching all of the doors. They didn't have $600 to help a single mom try to keep her house afloat while her abusive husband is gone, but they had however much money would etch the doors. Jesus was fine with that part.
Sure he was.
So for me, when I left the church, it was for that reason. I felt like that church wasn't following God's will. I couldn't wrap my head around that that God really wanted me to fail that badly. So I put the onus on the church at that point. But in doing so, my entire support system vanished. We had friends that were no longer speaking to us. You add in the divorce problems, and in addition to not going to church anymore, not going to that church anymore, my social network was gone. My help with my kids was gone. Having sitters that could help me out and things like that. I mean, your entire, especially as a woman, your entire social network is that church. So by leaving, I lost all of that instantly. And I was very, very alone from that point on. So I mean, that was the first reaction. It wasn't until much later that when I finally severed from the doctrine, that was a completely different loss at that point. We were very heavily involved in the homeschool community here, which is a very religious community. All from different churches, obviously, but very, very religious. And when I had that final separation from the doctrine, then we lost the rest of everybody. So it was like the people that hadn't already cut us off because of all the church stuff, they just waited until the religion stuff didn't quite work. And I think it was when I went to a Unitarian church for quite a while. And that was kind of the point that the homeschool community went, all right, that's enough. We're done with you. So lost all of that. So it was very, it's very silent. People didn't come out and say, okay, so we can't hang out with you anymore. Phone calls no longer were returned. Emails were not returned. Nobody checks on you anymore. Your kids stop getting invitations to play. It just becomes very quiet and very lonely, and it's really sad. Wow.
My wife and I are having strong reactions sitting here on the stage. It's hard to believe that stuff is actually still happening. It's incredibly. I don't know. I have so many words I want to say, but it's just beyond belief, honey.
Right. Well, I was going to ask our panelists. I mean, we are on. I'm not going to say a different plane, but we are coming. I am from a different angle looking at her situation. As a woman, as a theist. I want to hear what Michael and Sean have to say. I mean, what do you think about a church that would do this to a single mom without judging? Michael?
Well, I mean, this is a story I've heard a lot. Anybody who maybe they might not be the wife and might be the husband becomes a single father for whatever instance. And they find that, well, really, with what the church has taught them, with all the events going on in their life, they have questions that aren't quite sitting well. They go to get help. And as soon as they find they don't believe or they don't match with their church, everything starts drying up. And that's a control tactic. It's what it is. We want you back in the fold, and we will deny these services to you. And it's probably not active. People aren't thinking that way. But it's a very good way of making sure people stay in the church. Some people it doesn't work, however.
All right. Sean?
I think exactly what she's talking about is the problem that a lot of people have of walking away from a church because I think the most descriptive word is it's social suicide, where you lose your whole support group, you lose your friends, and your family in most cases, and in order to make the group feel more exclusive, I guess you would have to exclude some people from it, and unfortunately, that's you're excluding other human beings from being part of your group. But it lets the in-group feel good that they are specifically part of that. But I think that's the major difficulty when walking away, especially in Sarah's situation. That's double the courage, really, because that's hard to fathom.
I mean, she doesn't want to say that she had the courage, and probably she didn't think of it at the time, but looking at her as a woman and to become a single mom and knowing that you're going to lose your support system, that takes a lot of courage. A lot of people would just buck up and hang in there and fake it, and but I admire her for not doing that. She could have and probably got the $600. But you didn't, so I admire that.
So are you saying that she could have run a con?
She could have run a con.
I could have gotten my $600. There we go.
You sure could have.
At what price? My sanity. Apparently $600. There we go.
This happened recently, and it's strange. I try to do 1 to 2 miles every day, and I received a text message on my phone, and it was a good friend of ours. He's a pastor out in California, and he said, I'm being told right now I'm in a board meeting with my deacons and elders, and they're telling me that I can't listen to you, Dr. Jones, nor the New Covenant group any longer. And so his elders, his deacons, were telling him that he's got to quit listening. And they even brought out the statement of faith, that is, of the church that he pastored, because he was not teaching on hell or anything like that. He wasn't even teaching people needed to get saved or anything like that. He was just teaching concepts of how to love one another, and that's all he's been teaching. He'd only been there for about 20 years. But they approached him and they said, you've got to go back and start preaching this hellfire and brimstone. And this shocked him so much, he just walked out of the meeting. He said, I'm not going to have anything to do with this stuff, and I'm not going to use all the terms that he used, but he just walked out. And he hasn't been back, but they approached him a few days ago with a letter, and with a gentleman that took the letter to him, and they said, if you will go through church discipline, we can restore you back to being the pastor of this church. So he made a campfire and
Good for him.
burned the letter. And so I was very, very thankful for that. And I just got off the phone with him maybe 4 or 5 hours ago. And I was so thankful that he was willing to walk away from this abusive system. However, it's shocking that people are still pushing those kinds of things. In other words, we talk to people all the time about the Old Testament, killing everyone but 8 people. I mean, Noah and the ark, and I'm sure that you believed in that story at one time.
Completely.
And then, God using the prophet Samuel to tell the first king of Israel, go kill the men, the women, the children, and the infants, and that is with the sword. And then you just go through one story of genocide into infanticide, into the doctrines of slavery, etc. And just to get theists to simply be honest enough to say, that is bad. That's not moral. We have found that most theists will not be intellectually honest. And my question to you is, why?
Well, because it creates a conflict. In order to adhere to this mentality that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, you have to come to some sort of an acceptance that God is capable of evil, horrible things that we as humans cannot possibly understand or wrap our heads around. I'm gonna start slipping into my evangelical stuff here in just a second, but when we see those things, and this is with my Christian fundamentalist hat on, when we see those stories and they tug at our heartstrings and things like that, that's God using that as a lesson to us. Don't cross him. Don't don't put yourself in a situation where you're falling from God's favor, because God is capable of all these things. And God is not necessarily good in the sense that we think of good. And we just have to accept that, and essentially you're taught that you are just pawns in God's crazy little, World of Warcraft game, basically, where he can do whatever he wants and he can burn the whole thing down and whatever. And you may be able to appeal to his compassion, I guess you can call it, or not. We're fleas that he can flick around and do whatever he wants with, but he loves you and you should devote your life to him. That's just how that goes. And when there's several pastors that I actually meet with pretty regularly, and we have these conversations. And every single time they come down to it and they say, well, God is not necessarily good in the sense that we think of good. If he wants to wipe out all of humanity, that's his right to do so, because we are pawns and minions in his greater plan, and who are we to question that? And when they disconnect from compassion on that level, I guess in a sense you can at least give them a gold star for sticking with it. But trying to get them to understand what they're actually saying, like you were saying, as far as the morality behind it. I've tried to say to them, if you went and killed everyone, is that moral? Well, no, that's not moral. God says don't kill. Okay, so God can break his own commandments, but you can't.
Right. I mean, what a hypocrite, really.
And they say, yes, absolutely, God can do whatever he wants. And it's interesting to hear them say that, but I've heard it many, many, many times. I will say though, I think, that when you break it down to them on that level and you're talking to someone, I think finding out where they stand on, if they see the flood as the literal flood, if they see all the genocide as literal genocide, say, okay, that happened exactly the way the Bible says it happened. If they stop short and say, I don't understand why God did that, I think there's a slightly better chance of them at some point reconciling the rest of it and moving away from fundamentalism a little bit. When they sit there and look you dead in the eyes and say, yep, God did that, God killed all of them and didn't care about their screams, that tells you something about how locked in they are.
Exactly. This is like, I'm taking this leap right here, but I want to ask you, do you believe in the actual historical Jesus Christ?
That's a good question. I honestly haven't studied that in incredible depth. There may have been a Jesus Christ. There may have not been a Jesus Christ. There may have been numerous people who fit similar profiles that all came together in this mythology that became Jesus, which is probably the most likely in my opinion, because that's how lots of mythological stories have come together, as a compilation of things. But I don't know, and I don't know that it matters a whole lot, quite honestly. In my opinion, I'm really comfortable with the thought process that there's no omnipotent being or anything like that. So even if there was a Jesus Christ, it doesn't change my viewpoint a whole lot. It doesn't change how I live my life day to day. And if other people do, then good for them. I mean, it's, it doesn't bother me or offend me, but I don't see it as a necessary crux of my belief system.
What is the first thing that you do when people come your way that is in this, I don't want to call it a business, but maybe it is, recovering from religion?
Well, I get emails and phone calls all the time. The first thing I try to do is find out what kind of a support network they have. Sometimes we're getting emails and they're just saying, we just found you, and here's my story, and I have a support network, but I just have to tell somebody. I have to dump this out to someone who understands, and those are a little more encouraging to hear from, because that means they've got a support network in place. But regularly, I get emails from people who are absolutely alone, and they have no one they can talk to and no one to turn to. So the first thing I do is try to get them connected to a support network. We have a secret page on Facebook for people who cannot participate in our national Facebook page. who are looking for support as they're recovering from religion. So if we get an email from someone on Facebook who is on Facebook, I can point them in that direction. You know, we have facilitators all over the country. In fact, we've got them all over the world at this point. So I try to get them connected with a facilitator close to them. There are times when I get emails that are desperate enough, the first thing I do is get them in contact with a suicide hotline. Those are the most stressful because I don't usually hear back from them, and I just hope that they've gotten the help that they need. But when you start seeing things in these emails where they're saying, I'm at the end of my rope, I feel like I'm on the edge of a cliff, and they're using very permanent, fatalistic language, those kinds of things that trigger suicidal ideation, I try to get them to some sort of a resource that's much better equipped than we are to help them, but ultimately just try to get them some support. We've launched the fundraising for a project called the Hotline Project. And that's going to be an 800 number that people can call anonymously and talk to a trained crisis counselor to help them with all of this. To do what I'm doing right now, you know, pretty much 24/7 as these emails come in. But for these people to be able to talk to a live person who can help them, point them to resources in their area, give them book recommendations, meet them where they're at emotionally. It's not going to be an atheist deconversion line or anything like that. It's literally going to just be, you know, if someone calls in, let's use my example, and says, you know, I'm a Southern Baptist, but I'm kind of starting to think those American Baptists might be onto something. And they're starting to broaden their viewpoint a little bit. Our counselors are going to be trained to help them get resources to explore that concept. So we're not going to hand them the God delusion, you know, as Southern Baptists. we're going to get them some materials that help them as they're just on this journey away from this very confined faith. And that's kind of that's our big branch out project right now, because quite frankly, we will never have enough local groups. I have local facilitators. We have about 100, 125, it fluctuates, local groups that meet monthly all over the United States, throughout Canada, the UK, and starting up in Australia. And they're wonderful. These are awesome facilitators who have all been through some sort of deconversion, and they're wonderful, caring people. But we will never have enough of them. There will always be some part of the world, then some part of the country that we're not reaching, where people are needing our kind of help. And that's where the Hotline Project comes in. So that's our next big, you know, how we help them. But the biggest thing is getting them those resources and getting them that support.
That's marvelous. I'm going to ask our panel, starting with Sean. Have either one of you, starting with Sean, ever needed the services of something like Sarah's involved in, like recovering from religion? What would have helped each of you in your journeys?
I haven't personally needed it, but I was going to inject right after she got done talking there that I have came across it's a real interesting thread on Reddit. I can't think of the keyword to find it, but it's people who are offering, depending on the severity of what's happened after you've left religion, a place to stay, because in some situations you're out of the house. So there's this extremely long thread, and they're sorting it by like states and cities. And these are people who just have an extra room in their house that are willing to let you stay there until you can get everything sorted out. So I would encourage people, if the situation is, you know, that bad, to look that up, and there's plenty of people offering places to stay if that's something they needed.
I want to jump in and ask you a question, because I've met so many wonderful atheists. In fact, when I compare atheists to theists, it seems like atheists are so much more on the kind side of life. That's just my opinion. But there seems to be a hesitancy with atheists. In other words, we meet atheists a lot, but the first thing that you normally hear isn't like Greg Bray says. Greg Bray always comes on, I'm Greg Bray, I'm an atheist. And he does, you know, and that's wonderful. But that's not what you hear mostly from atheists, especially here in the South. Mostly what you hear is, I'm a humanist, or possibly a free thinker. not putting those organizations down, but it's rare that you hear, first of all, I'm an atheist. Why is that, in your opinion?
Are you asking me or one of the other panelists?
I was asking Sean, and I want you to answer that.
I would say because it's really just, in my opinion, the answer to one question: do you believe or don't you believe? It would be like saying, my name's Sean and I don't like cats. You know, that person may like cats, and I think what Greg does is probably how it, we should get to a point where we shouldn't have to identify ourselves like that. But given the time, it's more important that more people come forward and say it. But depending on who you're saying it to, that can be a conversation stopper. So there's 90 out of 100 good reasons not to title yourself that way.
Yeah, in preparation for this show, I received various phone calls, and when I mentioned the term atheist, click, and the conversation was over. And so, I mean, does this happen often with you guys?
With me, when I'm working, I work in a machine shop, I will never identify as an atheist in that situation. When I was doing martial arts, almost every martial arts studio I go to, they will probably have John 3:16 and a picture of Christ somewhere in the building. And don't know what the correlation there is, if there is one, but that's just something I've noticed. And it's just, for me, I always have better things to talk about anyway. It's not a big thing for me. If someone if I get into a discussion with a person and they want to talk about religion somehow, however it might come up, then I will go into it. And partially because as involved as I am in Gulf Coast Free Thinkers and other things, yeah, I'm an atheist. That's an answer to one question. I'm a humanist. That's an answer to a different question. I'm a free thinker. That's kind of, to me, also a different answer to a different question. So it really kind of depends on the context.
Lots of people here in the South are afraid to come out of the closet, that is, concerning their mindset of atheism. And it has to do with they may lose their job, etc. Can you speak to that, Sarah?
Oh, absolutely, and it's certainly not isolated to the South. There is no question. I work with people all the time. They've lost their jobs. They've lost their families. They've lost custody of their children. I mean, the knee-jerk reaction from the rest of the community when they hear that someone no longer believes or just simply doesn't go to church anymore, which is actually more common of a catalyst. It's amazing how widespread that is. I just had an email a couple weeks ago that from a gentleman, and he was heartbroken and very desperate, and he's one that we did end up sending over to a suicide line because his boss had realized he wasn't in church anymore. It was a relatively small town, and they all went to the same church apparently, and his boss had a problem with him not attending church anymore and fired him. And it was apparently a right-to-work state and all of that, so there wasn't anything he could do. So then his wife found out, obviously, that he had lost his job, and she wanted to know why, and he had to explain it, which then created that conversation that he wasn't intending on having. And it became this huge domino effect of, within a day and a half, he went from a fairly stable employed, husband and father to unemployed. His wife is talking about divorce, everything simply because he didn't go to church. And he never said in his email that he was an atheist. He never even said he didn't believe in God anymore. He just didn't like going to church. He didn't agree with it anymore. And I don't tend to really nitpick those issues with them. If they're coming to us with that sort of a problem, it's fairly irrelevant what their theological viewpoint is. But that's how prominent it is. I get those emails from people all the time, and I think it's just that knee-jerk reaction. What the fundamentalist or the very conservative religious communities tend to do, they otherize everyone and they demonize people outside of their belief system. So if all these people know is if you don't agree with me, you're evil and you're satanic, And then someone who they know and love comes up and says, I don't agree with you anymore. They immediately get put into that category of being evil and satanic, and they have to be cut off. And since the Bible says that's what you're supposed to do anyways, they've got all this backing for it, and it becomes justified in their mind. And they may be heartbroken over it. They may be mourning themselves that they have to cut this person out of their life. But they're very, very willing to do it.
If you have a question or a comment, I want to give you a number. The number is 850-572-7441. That's 850-572-7441. We are getting various messages already, and I will probably start asking some of the questions that are coming in and even make some of the comments. But one of the things that I want to give you the ability to do tonight is to simply share with people how they can find you, that is on the net, and give out the proper information, because we certainly want to support recovering from religion.
Thank you. Yeah, people can go to our website. It's recoveringfromreligion.org. It's exactly like it sounds, all one word. And then they can also find us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/recoveringfromreligion. If people are in the process of recovering and they're still closeted in their belief and they need somewhere safe, but they don't have a group near them, or they don't feel like they can go to a group near them, you can send us an email at admin@recoveringfromreligion.org and ask to be added to the private Facebook page. We do have very strict rules with the Facebook page, the private one, for discussion and for confidentiality and things like that. So we'll get you a copy of those rules. As long as you're on board with that, you'll be added to the group. And then, like I said, we're working on the hotline project. As soon as we have that up, I will make sure and let you guys know what that 800 number is, so people can get a hold of us that way. We do have on our website, we have a Find a Group tab where people can go and look for a group near them. If people are listening and watching who are interested in starting a group in your area, there is also a tab that says Start a Group. It's a very simple process to get that going, and filling out the form just gets us in contact with you to tell you what's all involved and get you more information. It's not a commitment to do anything. So we are always happy to get as many groups started as possible. So yeah, just get in touch with us however works for you, and we'll get you connected in the right direction.
Sarah, when you were telling that story about the deacons who wouldn't help you with your rent when you were so desperate, this commenter said that my wife, Rhonda, looks really annoyed, and said, I don't blame her. She was really annoyed while you were stating that, by the way. And I know that you can't see her while this is going on, but this is so sick. I really get tired of all of this dominance by men in not just theology, but also in politics and across the board. You've come a long way, and you have a powerful voice. It's very impressive. My wife and I are very impressed with what you're doing. What has given you such a vision?
Honestly, just my own experiences. I know how incredibly lonely that process was. You know, I went through my own deconversion over the past probably 8 years or so. I just came to the point that I identified as an atheist in the past 2 or 3 years. Prior to that, I called myself non-religious for a really long time. I said that I was spiritual but not religious, kind of played with all these terms, and then finally got to the point that I said I'm pretty comfortable just saying that I don't think that there's much out there. But my passion is to help other people through this process without them feeling so alone and so lost, because the one thing I hear from everybody who gets in contact with us is, I just wish you had been here 10 years ago because I was going through the same thing, which one tells me I wasn't actually alone 10 years ago when I was going through this. No. I just felt like I was. And two, that if we can just get the word out about what we're doing and the community that we're building for people, it's going to be quite a refuge for everyone. And that's the goal, really, is, you know, there are people who identify as religious and they're very happy with that. They don't have any negative feelings about it. It's not negatively impacting their life as far as they're concerned. And great, good for them. But there are a lot of people who feel differently, and that's who we're here for. And that's who I want to reach out to, is to let them know you're not alone. You are okay the way you are, and we're here to help.
So just to sort of recap, you just don't cater to atheists. I mean, if someone says,
No.
"Oh, I feel like I'm an atheist now and I need to recover from religion. I'm going to, go to recoveringfromreligion.org." It doesn't matter if I decide that, church is harmful to me. I can still get in contact with you and still believe in God, believe in Jesus, and you can help me through some transitions.
Absolutely. The entire intent of Recovering from Religion is to help people who have been negatively impacted by religion in their life. Ultimately, we like to see people feel like religion no longer has that influence on them. If you take a look at our spectrum of disbelief, which I don't know if we just revamped our website, so I don't know if that tab is up right this minute, but on the spectrum of disbelief, we like to encourage people to get to a point on the spectrum where they no longer feel like God or a religious entity or religion in general is dictating their day-to-day life, is controlling their paycheck or how much of it they get to enjoy and how much they're required to give to the church, is providing micromanagement over their bedroom life, over their relationships, over their sexuality, their gender identity, anything like that. We want to help people get to a point where they're okay with who they are, and when they look in the mirror, it doesn't matter whether they identify as religious or theist or not theist. The fact is that religion is an unnecessary force, and when we can help them get to that point, however they define themselves is certainly their right to do so.
One of the things that I've been teaching for years is that you're good enough. And whether there is a God or not, you're good enough for God. You're good enough for His love. You're good enough for His protection. And if He actually is our Father, you're certainly good enough to be supported and protected by Him. But my point is simply trying to tell human beings they are good enough. I've been very impressed with that statement that you keep making over and over again. You're good enough. You're just fine. That's a powerful statement. And that leads me to actually a question. How many people do you meet, that is through your organization, who feel as if they can't achieve that mindset, that is, not feeling good enough?
A lot. That's probably one of the most overwhelming feelings that people work with. I try to talk to people about the inherent codependency of religion, and I talked to you about that in email a little bit. But when religion says you have to have this relationship with this being, and this being judges you, it sees you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It can read your mind. It can control your life. If you make it mad, it will make you miserable. If you are miserable, you must have made it mad, even if you don't know what you did, and all those things. You're teaching people to have a very imbalanced view of relationships and boundaries, personal identity, those sorts of things. So this concept of you are not good enough has been there from the minute they can understand anything they're being told. So toddlers, really. And then you get into the concept of being taught original sin, and you use terms from childhood, with you're fallen away and saved by grace, which is basically, well, I'm gonna cut you some slack, even though you're worthless. Those kinds of things. You're talking a level of brainwashing that it's incredibly insidious, and it gets into the fiber of everyone who participates in that, willingly or not. And I think shaking that is one of the most difficult things people can do, is to come to a point where they can say, I am good enough the way I am, exactly the way I am. That's okay. And it's very widespread. That's one of the most common conversations with our facilitators. We have a facilitators page that's private for all of them on Facebook. And we talk constantly. And these are all our facilitators leading local groups all over the world. And that's one of the things that comes up. How do we help these people get to a point where they can they can feel okay. And sometimes we have to really refer them out to therapy. One of our other projects is the Secular Therapist Project. It's run by Dr. Dale Ray, and that helps people get in contact with therapists who use secular methodology instead of, prayer to help with any kind of recovery from, things that they need to work on. But this it's very widespread to have people have this belief that there's something inherently wrong with them.
I want you to do us a favor. There are gays being bashed every day. Mm-hmm. This is a major problem across the United States, all over the world. Can you speak to that and actually tell gays that they are good enough? I would like for you to do that on our show, because
absolutely,
it's very important for us to let people know, hey, you're of value. You're not worthless. You're not wretched. You're worth something. You're extremely valuable, and if you would speak to that, we would so appreciate that.
Absolutely. I think you just said it very, very, very well, but that's exactly it. Regardless of how you identify on the sexuality spectrum, how you identify with gender, regardless of how that matches up with your body, regardless of who you're attracted to and why, it is okay to be who you are. I'm a huge, huge supporter of consenting adults can do what they want to do, and that's their business. I also want to encourage anyone who's watching, if you have any challenges with your sexuality or reconciling your sexuality with religion or the influence of religion in your life, there are two things that are really important with that Recovering from Religion can help you with. One is a book written by our founder, Dr. Dale Ray. It's a book called Sex and God. And it addresses sexuality and religion in a fantastically powerful way. And it's wonderful. So definitely find that on Amazon. And a little plug, if you go to our website and click on the Amazon link on our website, we get like 35 cents per book. So that would be awesome. But then the second thing is, here coming up in about 6 or 8 weeks, when we have it finalized, we have a recovering from sexuality recovering workshop. I'm not saying that correctly, so the gal who's running that, she'll correct me, but it's going to be a 6 to 8 week online webinar program where people who are dealing with any kind of negative influence on their sexuality by religion can come and work through these concepts and really get to a point where they can embrace their sexuality and they can realize that they are okay, these wonderful, unique individuals. How boring would the world be if we all were exactly alike? And that's what these religions do, is they tell everybody the only way to be is this one shade of sexuality, and how completely boring that is. I can't even imagine. And that's coming from someone I identify as straight. I'm nowhere on that spectrum. But I love the rainbow concept. Because of that, because what a great prism of all these different viewpoints and identities, and yeah, you are okay. You are a beautiful, wonderful person the way you are, and nobody needs to change that.
That's good.
About 3 things I want to do. First of all, I want to get a shot of Vince. If y'all can cut to Vince, he is working his little heart out on his canvas, and honestly, I couldn't tell you what it's going to be, but I know Vince knows, and it looks like he's doing some, what do you call that? Like
landscape.
No, it's like a person. Profile.
Oh.
You're doing people. Yeah. Okay, exactly. So Vince has it going on behind us, if you've noticed, and I didn't want y'all to get confused and think he's Peter Ruckman back there doing chalk drawings. But Vince actually is doing a fantastic job, and so that's cool. And also, I want to read a couple of things from our chat here. Tally says the conversations are very interesting and enlightening. And let's see. Tina says to Sarah, wonderful assessment, Sarah. You nailed it. That was back probably 30 minutes ago. So whatever you were saying, she assessed it as wonderful.
Thank you.
And also a viewer says, courage is exactly what happened in this situation. Doing what was necessarily right in the interest of her children in the face of intimidation. It's an inspiring story. And if you just inspire one person tonight, and I know you have inspired many, I think it's well worth it. And then I was going to go to our panelists and say, give us a story, a short story of how religion maybe has harmed you. If you have one, maybe you haven't been harmed by religion, but I want to hear a story. Give us a story, Michael.
Okay, and I know my tendency to ramble, so I'll try to be quick. But I was going to say the one that really sticks out to me is when I was a kid, I loved science. I just loved it. I had books. When Pensacola Christian went to be Pensacola Christian Academy, they had to clear out their library of certain books that were no longer appropriate. And I think I got all of them.
Such as? What kind of books were not appropriate?
This is going back many years, so I want to make... I don't like them, but I don't want to be too hard, any harder than I need to be. But I remember a couple of books that were on dinosaurs. One book on... this was dealing with the life you'll find at the edge of the seashore, so different types of plants and animals and how they've adapted and stuff like that. So, and history books on American history, which, as far as I can recall, were not the type that they tend to sell now, without going into detail there. But I used to, all kinds of just science and history, I just loved it. Everything on television that would come up, loved it. But as I got older in Pensacola Christian, very poor science education goes on there. Even when I transferred out of there to St. Michael's, I did have some good teachers, but I think it's more of an issue of the school system at that point, of it being a private school system. You get the people who want to teach who may not be the best quality to teach. And so I wound up with teachers who are very fundamentalist when it came to teaching science. And over time, that interest I have just died off. There was nothing there to keep it going. I'd have excuse me, I'd have one or two good teachers. And that's why I dislike when people, you just need the right teacher. No, you need several different good teachers and different people there to kind of help keep you going. And so I don't want to say I never had any good teachers who were religious when it came to science. I had two very, very good ones who I wish I'd been able to spend more time with. But for the most part, the very much harmed my view on science. And it was 2-3 years out of high school, actually, before I, by doing my own thing, stumbled back into it and realized how much stuff that I would have loved, that I loved. And that's the only way to say it, is I loved what I was learning now. And that had just gone over my head for almost 20 years, really, because I started at K4. So almost 20 years of just having that interest and drive just pretty much completely shut down.
Wow. I mean, that's mammoth. Sean?
I guess my story about how religion's affected me would be a little bit different, which would be, I said on the other show, when my father passed away, my mother had, she was about a year into a, I forgot what they call one step below Pentecostal, the new church. Anyways, she was really involved in the church. And what happened was after my father had passed away, instead of getting that comforting, he's in a better place now, he's looking down on us, she went into the, I want to only be with him. I want to, couldn't do anything except, she wanted to die. She had lost her will to live, so that she could be with him. So it didn't really offer her the comfort, and she knew that I didn't really. When those subjects come up about do you believe in everything, that she took that deeply offensive, and then what it eventually does is it put a permanent divide between the two of us. That's irreconcilable. There's no talking, because we're basically there's talking past each other, because she thinks that I'm destined for hell and more of a poison to her social structure, so it's easier to just keep it completely separated. So I got to see what it can do when you either pretend death doesn't exist, or you just have this urge to join somebody who's passed over to the other side. So that would be my.
Wow, that's huge. That is.
I would like to step into a different category altogether. I want to ask you a few questions, Sarah, if I can.
Of course.
I ask this question often, and most theists, they actually answer in a way that really shocks me. But I simply want to get your reaction, and I want the guys in the control room to have your face on camera by the time that I get to the end of this question. Is it ever moral for any father to have his child beaten beyond recognition and tortured to death so that he can help and or forgive the rest of his children?
Unequivocally, absolutely not.
Why do so many people believe that story? Penal substitution, atonement stories. I mean, why are people buying into that kind of crap?
I love that you called it crap. Thank you. Because I think we go back to that concept of you are not good enough. So you are so damaged and you are so worthless that the only way you could possibly be saved from eternal damnation that God we'll put that on the shelf for a minute, but the only way you could possibly be saved is for someone to make this horrible sacrifice of brutalizing their only child, except you're their child. Anyways, I'm not going to keep going on that, but I think people accept that and people believe it because it's a demonstration of how worthless they are, not how worthy they are. Is that making sense?
Certainly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it validates and reinforces the inherent worthlessness of the human condition from their viewpoint, which is obviously completely incorrect. But if you want to take that, if you take the crucifixion at face value, that's essentially what's being said. You are so horrible that the only way to fix it is for someone to suffer so brutally. And one of the questions I like to ask people when they tell me how they believe every word of that, and they, obviously point to the Passion of the Christ, the movie, and all that stuff, is I say, well, doesn't the Bible say we're all God's children? So sending his only child, now let's think about that for just a second. How is there one or are there many? And of course that gives them pause, and then they have their answers for it. But people cling to that because it reinforces what they've already been taught. And if you truly believe that you're worthless and you truly believe that you're not good enough, just inherently people seek out information that confirms their own belief. And I think that's what they're doing there.
One time we obviously have a lot of ecclesiastical conversations, theological and conversations between my husband and myself. And one time we were laying there in the bed and I said, you know what? I said, what's the verse about, greater love hath no man than he laid down his life for another? I mean, that's admirable. That's marvelous. But if people are to believe that, then God said, greater love hath no man, but you go ahead, Jesus, you lay your life down. So, I mean, I don't want to do it. I'm going to let you do it. And how crazy is that? If you believe the Trinity type theology, which, obviously we don't. But I do believe that Jesus was and is an historical figure, and there was a crucifixion. I believe that as a theist, and I don't believe obviously it was for any type of penal substitution. I believe he was murdered. I believe people couldn't handle his message. They were more into religion and theology, and he wasn't. And they didn't like it, and they killed him. So that's where I come from, to put it on the table.
Mm-hmm.
How many theists do you meet that are rational?
That's a great question. I think it depends on, I think rational is a percentage when it comes to most people that I interact with who identify as theistic. I tend to attract the more fundamentalist mentality. As far as people who are getting in contact with me just to argue with me and to try to prove how wrong I am and all those wonderful things. They're rational to some extent. They can deal with the here and now. They can utilize logic to a certain point. But then there does come a point where they put that all on the shelf and they abandon that. And they start to fall back on, well, but it's just faith. I just have to believe that because I'm told to believe it because the book says to believe it, and the book says it's true, so it must be true because the book says it's true, and all of that circular reasoning. So, I think the people that I work with who are coming to recovering from religion because they are really feeling the negative impacts of religion in their life, they're starting to embrace rational thought so much more. And what tends to happen is, the house of cards starts to fall fairly quickly after that. So it's really, I think it just depends on their motivation. The people who are coming to actually be a part of recovering from religion and find a way for it to help them, they're learning to be more rational. And that's always an interesting and exciting, waking up period, which I can identify with and I really remember. But then the other segment that they're getting a hold of me just to remind me I'm going to burn in hell and the skin will peel from my bones and all of those delightfully horrid things. Obviously they hung up their rational coat quite a while ago. So.
I want to be clear on this. Do you think it's possible to be a theist and be rational?
I don't know. I don't know that there's a clear black and white on that. In my opinion, I don't see any evidence for any sort of theistic viewpoint. Does that mean there isn't any? Does that mean there's absolutely, positively, unequivocally zero supernatural being? I think all evidence points to no. But can other people come to a different conclusion and be rational? Sure. So I don't know. Part of leaving this fundamentalist mentality is I no longer claim absolute knowledge over all these different wonderful ideas. I don't think any of us can say, and in fact I know for a fact nobody does that I can think of, say there's absolutely no possible way that this belief is correct or this belief is wrong or whatever. So I'm not sure. I think what you guys are trying to do and the conversations you guys have are probably the most rational conversations I've been a part of with people who identify as theistic. And I have quite a few friends who are and really have the same viewpoint. In fact, I sent them the link to this, and I'm hoping that they're watching tonight. But they identify as Christian. They raise their kids in a very loving, equal viewpoint home. They don't condemn anything, and they are very rational, wonderful, loving people. They have a supernatural belief. That's the part where we disagree, but that's okay.
What about our panelists? Same question that Dr. Jones posed to Sarah. Do you think that theists have any remote possibility of being rational?
I can think of one person off the top of my head who I would say was a very rational person and was religious, and that would be Martin Gardner, a fellow who used to work actually for the Center for Skeptical Inquiry.
Well, you just called me irrational just by saying that.
Well, I was saying one person off the top of my head. I know. As a very, very good example. And this is someone who, he was with Carl Sagan, James Randi, all these well-known skeptics. He wrote many good books and many articles on skepticism, on things we should be skeptical of and how to be skeptical. So off the top of my head, I can think of him as a very good example of someone who was religious, or he was a theist. I don't think he was actually particularly religious. He was a deist, but he also fully admitted, I don't really have evidence for this, but I still believe. And that is probably, for me at least, would be a go-to example. That is the most rational response I've heard in that sense is, yeah, I have no evidence for this, but I do believe. And as an example of how rational he was, he has, or he has his entire work history of what he did. So yeah, very much so. But like she said, I do agree. It is a spectrum. There are people who are theistic and more rational than others, and a lot of them who are very rational until it gets to a religious topic.
That's true. Sean?
And I think if they, it depends on how they describe it. If they describe it as a faith, I would say that's a pretty rational statement right there. Just, this is my faith, it's personal to me. I don't have any evidence for it, and I don't see a problem with that. That's being reasonable. And one of the questions, so I don't tread on too harsh of territory with people, is when they do want to talk about theology, I always ask them if they care if it's true or not. And I do get different answers. If they don't care it's true, then that's fine. They can compartmentalize that and let it just be a part of them. But if they do care if it's true, then we definitely have a conversation to have. But being rational, there's plenty of doctors and scientists and Nobel Prize winners who can successfully do their work and do it very well and have a personal belief. Just they smart enough to know, or they know enough about their belief that they wouldn't really try to compel it onto someone else, that it's personal. And I can respect that.
Oh, that's fair enough.
Do you think that atheists look into every aspect of theism? That is, when they say no to theism. Sarah? Because theism is a very broad category, and I find that when, as a linguist and translator, when dealing with ancient documents, I find very few people, that is today, who even address the real issues of the text adequately. I find most of what's being talked about by atheists and theists alike is simply a failed model of metalanguage. And if we reject a failed model of metalanguage, that's one thing. I don't mind putting the alpha privative in front of theism concerning all of that. But when you start looking at different models of theism that are based upon fluency, models of translation theory rather than all of these synthetics, we're not even talking about apples and apples. We're talking about apples and possibly watermelon, something that's distant. And so I find that in the atheistic community, for the most part, and this is not trying to make a negative statement, but I find that the majority of the chatter, the talk that goes on, isn't even in the ballpark of actually what is stated by any of those who wrote X, Y, or Z, that is, about theology. And so that concerns me, because linguistic science is our oldest science. And there are very many proofs, much evidence that we have, but I fail to see, simply when people can't understand the evidence. Lots of times people say there is no evidence, and I back away, and I will simply allow people to say, well, there is no evidence. Well, if that's what you think to be true, that's fine. It reminds me of 200 years ago when people would say, well, there's no evidence, fingerprints all over the gun. And today we understand that there's fingerprints all over the gun. And as a linguist, I see that there are methods and practices in linguistic science that do give us the ability to make arguments that are very legitimate concerning various models of theism. And so my concern is that atheism isn't really embracing linguistic science. What are your thoughts?
I think those are interesting points to make. I guess from a personal level, well, one, I don't in any way claim to speak for atheists in general at all. So I need to definitely say that. But from my own personal perspective, I would just simply say if there was evidence for a theistic viewpoint 200 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, there would be evidence for a theistic viewpoint now. And that would be my basis. I haven't studied the linguistics. I know when I first started digging in, which tends to be one of the first stages of people moving away, they rather than reject it, they start digging in and going, okay, I'm going to find what the original texts were and all that. And I went to Christian bookstores that had the English translation of the original text. They have all those books and everything. So how accurate any of those were, I don't know. But I went through that and trying to understand what did they mean before the King James Bible and all those things. But as a whole, my experience is that the atheistic viewpoint is just simply as it stands right now. There doesn't seem to be evidence for a belief in any sort of supernatural being, and that it's pretty much left at that. I think there are tremendous different ways to look at the history of how the Bible became the Bible that everybody waves around right now. And I think that stuff is fascinating. I find language fascinating, and the translation of cultures is so interesting, and all those things from a historical viewpoint. And in a similar way that I would see any other awesome ancient book that's been translated a bunch, and to find out what they really meant, I would be really fascinated in that. But I don't think it would necessarily change someone's mind from a theistic perspective. Because again, if there was something, if there was evidence for theism 2,000 years ago, why wouldn't there be evidence now?
I'm not suggesting that there isn't evidence. I'm simply asking the question, do we understand all of the evidence that we're actually looking at? And I don't think that we do, and we have too many accounts. I gave you one, for instance, 200 years ago, looking at the same piece. Today we have the ability to analyze things a little bit more appropriately. And I think that science is very much in what's called an infantile state. In other words, science is not a discipline that will remain static. It's not going to have an orthodoxy completely that stays static, but it's going to continue to move forward. And I can say that is in linguistic science, it's moving rapidly. And today we do have a better viewpoint of the past, and there's a big difference between evidence that is presented from a deistic model and a theistic model, two different things. And we find that in science we have things that do happen in particular points in time, whereas they don't happen, and we have all kinds of things that may be possible. And I'm simply asking the question, why are people like Richard Dawkins, who is very much an atheist in the sense of he's really trying to deconvert people by using misinformation. And that bothers me because he's a wonderful biologist, but he speaks well outside of his discipline. He's abysmally ignorant and illiterate when it comes to actually the primary text, and yet he is bashing. And is that good? Is that actually rational?
I think I see where you're going with it. One of the things I teach my kids, when we talk about religion and things like that is, thousands of years ago when people saw lightning, they thought Zeus was in the skies throwing lightning bolts. And then thousands of years later, they learned what the science was behind it to explain it. So imagine what 1,000 years from now we will know and understand as science progresses and things like that. So I think are you kind of correlating kind of that thought process?
Not really. I think that the Bible is filled mostly, with lots of legend, myth, etc. But there is evidence. There is evidence that Jesus would defeat myth with myth, legend with legend, hyperbole with hyperbole, etc. But there is evidence within the various manuscripts that do indicate a model that would suggest that these individuals who were writing were not lying, exaggerating. For instance, if you look at the Old Testament writings are actually written in a form called an abjad, and I've spoke on this many times. And I can say that an abjad is a consonantal text. It's not just a consonantal text without vowels. It's also a structured nominal language which says we're not even going to deal with acquative or ergative verbs. It's also a text that has the absence of about 10% of the transitive and intransitive verbs. And if you can picture this, for instance, in analogy with the Constitution of the United States, if we took all the acquatives out of it, that is verbs, and we took 10% of the transitive and intransitive verbs out of it, and then we took all the vowel points out of it, and then we gave it to our senators and congressmen, how clear would that be? It wouldn't be clear, would it?
Of course not.
Okay, my point is, traditionally, the Jews would treat their text basically as something that was very much like abstract art. We have an artist behind us who is doing a marvelous job. I don't know what he's creating yet, but I'm willing to wait for it. But my point is, it was very, very abstract, and that was a practice of religion. When Jesus came, and let's just pretend for the sake of argument, when Jesus came and he started speaking, he didn't compliment the law, but he actually spoke against the law, contested the law. He contested all the theologies that we've been talking about, all of this abuse. And I think that most people would applaud Jesus if they actually knew what he was saying. And number two, when the writers started writing about what Jesus wrote, they did not use the writing system that was ambiguous, but they put it in a very polished form of Greek, which could be actually understood. In other words, if these people were trying to hide something, manipulate something, and trying to hide something, why would they not continue the tradition, that is, of the Jews, to keep writing in an abjad system? Why would they go into something that's very clear and pristine, something that's an accuracy-based model of writing? And so when you start looking at linguistic evidence, you're going to find that these writers are in various places, putting their lives in jeopardy, testifying somewhat to the same thing. Now, it's true, people like Bart Edelman will say they are not saying something identical. Well, the tradition of the day was never to quote anyone verbatim, so that's a non-issue. My point is, there is evidence of these people experiencing something that's extraordinary. I'm not saying that all of this points to divinity, but I'm not convinced that Jesus was trying to say, let's talk about God, because if Paul is right, he stated that Jesus emptied himself, that is, of all the notions of God. And so if we look at Jesus, he is not one advocating a theistic model. He is one trying to advocate something that would be meaningful to all of us as human beings. And so I think that there is a form of theism that's being developed from better models that might present something that we wouldn't even call theism in a sense. And so what are your thoughts?
Honestly, that sounds like humanism, quite frankly.
I would agree.
And I'm a huge supporter of humanism. So, no, I think I see what you're saying with that. And I honestly haven't studied any of that enough to be able to speak to that a whole lot, other than to say, that I think, there are always things that happen that we don't have an explanation for yet. And maybe that's the case. Maybe things happened that they just weren't able to explain. And whether or not we can explain them now, who knows? Whether or not we can explain them in 1,000 years, who knows? I don't know that form of those writings and things like that, when people are talking about atheism as a rejection of the idea that there's an omnipotent or supernatural being, I think you're correct that they're not, necessarily even taking those things into account. It's certainly, the first I've heard of them. But I don't know that necessarily changes the viewpoint either. So I'm probably just not well educated in that area enough to speak to it too adequately.
For instance, years ago, that is 2,000 years ago, many writers would say, that's theism. What were they talking about? They were not talking about people who believed in God. A theistic model could be someone simply crafting something based upon what they thought to be true. And so theistic models are not always about God. And I think oftentimes people get trapped into these conversations concerning God when theism actually years ago was an extremely broad category instead of the small category that we moderns like to talk about. And I just thought I'd bring up some of these curiosity questions from time to time. Sean, what are your final thoughts? We're almost out of time.
I would, to comment about what you were saying kind of about Richard Dawkins, I think why he's so, and a lot of atheists are strident about it, isn't because it's the general understanding of it. If you just say a certain percentage of people believe the King James Version of the Bible, so given some of the stories and some of the things that are involved in, let's just say, the King James Version, it becomes harder and harder to even dignify it as informative. If you're gonna say there's good things in the book, bad stuff, but at the very end it says, "Love thy neighbor." Well, you've just spent all these pages going from, and I like how you said it, from killing spree to killing spree, but love thy neighbor at the end. So it becomes, at least in my opinion, easy to just dismiss it outright and say, love thy neighbor, or take a humanistic role on it. The people that are doing the most damage to society are using a more standard English version. So those are, you kind of have to fight fire with fire.
Certainly.
And it's not worth, at least in my opinion, it's not worth trying to correct the people holding up the sign that say God hates fags by telling them that there's a conflict in maybe the way that you're understanding it. The way that they understand it is very harmful to other people, and they're doing damage. So they should be talked to on that level. If they could show themselves to be someone who has some intelligence, and you could have an exchange of ideas with them, then maybe the linguist would have a place at the stage there. But if that's just their message that they're putting out there, then I don't think dignifying it with a conversation about how they might have it wrong is all that helpful, in my opinion.
Michael?
Well, first he mentioned earlier there's a website where people can go if they're an atheist, if they've lost their home or been kicked out or whatever. The name of that Reddit page is Atheist Havens. So just, if anybody listening is an atheist or sympathetic atheist and wants to help out or is looking for an option, just check it out.
Say it one more time.
Atheist Havens. That's atheist and then HAVENS.
It'd be reddit.com/r/atheist havens. Yep.
Yeah. I'm not hip to all that lingo, so thank you.
I just want to clarify, because if you just put in atheist havens, that might not get you where you want to go with the internet being what it is. So.
Yeah. But with Dawkins, Dawkins is someone who, I think as far as I know, he was raised an atheist. He's always been an atheist. But when it came to attacking religion, he was never that much into it to begin with. And he's a evolutionary biologist. That's what his field of study is, and that's what he's done for many years. And the reason why he now attacked religion, there's two main reasons. One, they kind of went after him first. And so all of his stuff since then has been a response to the people attacking him. So he's responding like to like in that instance. Also, September 11th is what really brought him out, as well as Christopher Hitchens and others. Is what really kind of made people step back and say, you know, maybe Islam is bad, but you know, some of this other stuff that these other people are doing, we need to address that as well.
But let's be fair to the argument, you know, just for the sake of, you know, what we do here. We're trying to gather atheists and theists alike so we can have reasonable arguments. Richard Dawkins reminds me of a person who's trying to deal with that idea of theism that's very much like flat earth theology, instead of dealing with something that's really critically put together by reconstruction models that we do have now. And so why is he wasting his time going after something that is laughable? I mean, is he just trying to gain mileage, or is he trying to be rational? He's practicing outside of his discipline. He's going after flat earth theology instead of dealing with a more reasonable understanding of the text. And people, there are so many people who are wrestling now with reconstruction models of the text and why we had a major paradigm shift about 2,000 years ago. That's very important to people in anthropology, linguistic scientists, everywhere. All of this stuff is meaningful, and this should be meaningful to him. And my question is, why isn't he dealing with that legitimately? I'm not trying to put him down. I think he's a great biologist, but he's practicing way outside of his discipline. And my question is, why?
He's dealing with the form of religion that he finds most harmful. When you talk about the people who are, and I'm sorry, I cut off Sarah.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'll jump in here in just a second, but go right ahead.
Okay. He's dealing with people who are fundamentalist Christian, who are actively fighting against teaching evolution, modern sciences, the placement of women in society. He's fighting against fundamentalist Islam, and all the ways that they really share a lot in common with fundamentalist Christians. That I know of, he doesn't really have that much of an issue with people who are of a different form of Christianity. He has willingly worked with people who are religious as long as they support science. He has no issue with them.
But if he supported good linguistic science, he could defeat that in a moment. With his popularity right now, we would not have fundamentalism. I hope that fundamentalism falls within the next 5 to 10 years. I'm all for that. But my question is, why would he not use a sensible and a rational principle that is in linguistics, etc.? Why would he not use those kind of tools that he has at his availability? He has that available, but he's not using that. It seems like he's just wanting to go after some poor, failed system.
It might be poor and failed, but it's still very much alive in the South here in the U.S.
Exactly.
And other parts of the U.S. It's still very much active in the Middle East, and his home in the U.K. is experiencing issues with fundamentalist Islam.
But the way that we defeated flat earth science wasn't to use flat earth science. My point is, we defeated flat earth science by showing a better model. And my point is, why isn't he showing the better model to defeat the flat earth theology? Do you see my point?
I just want to jump in here. I think to answer that question specifically, I would guess that Professor Dawkins sees a secular society, a humanist society, as the most reasonable and logical course for humanity to be successful. That would be my guess. I have had the privilege of interacting with him personally and talking to him about recovering from religion. I know he's very supportive of the Clergy Project and of the people who are involved with recovering from religion. He is tremendously compassionate, and he sees the pain that people are experiencing and it's very widespread from these viewpoints and these fundamentalist ideologies. And I think that's why he's so vehement and outspoken the way he is. I obviously cannot speak for him, and I don't claim to in any way, but my experience in interacting with him is that he cares so much for all these people who are being hurt by these belief systems. And it would just seem to make sense at that point that that he would likely see that just a humanist secular society is the most logical result of, or the most logical direction that we need to go. That would be my guess. But that might be something for you to try to get in contact with them and have him on the show and ask him. I mean, that would be a wonderful conversation to have.
That would, and I want you to know that we support, or supported, I should say, Christopher Hitchens. I think he was a marvelous individual. And we do support Richard Dawkins much in every way. He's a brilliant man.
That is true.
I'm simply, and I can see his passion, putting out footage like the Jesus Camp. Wow, that's a game changer. He's doing a marvelous work. The Richard Dawkins Foundation, I support that. My wife and I do. We support him much in every way. I'm just asking just basic questions. This movement of rational thinking can actually make much more ground quickly if we do practice within our disciplines and get other people to come along to where we can defeat certain things. Because many people, I mean, this is huge, what you're talking about tonight. Recovering from religion. Religion is not small.
That's true.
This is a big dragon. This is a big dog. This is not, it's a mean dog. And I want to help you. My wife and I want to help you, Sarah. We want to help you succeed. We are tired of religion. We want to see it cease in our lifetime, but we can't do so if we're not using reasonable methods. This is the only reason that I'm bringing up these kind of questions. I'm not trying to bash Richard Dawkins in any sense of the word. Love the guy, appreciate his work, would love to have him on our show, would welcome him. But I would question him, why use flat earth theology to do your work? Why not move it up a little bit and use something that's reconstructed in a better, sensible way? And you're going to make the rest of that look so foolish, we can move on.
Well, I think the issue is that the people who he's addressing, they're not listening to the more reasonable people. And you can have with a reasonable religious person, you can have a great debate. And no, here's how we see this testament, and if we go back, we can see this here. You can have that discussion with reasonable people. But the people that Dawkins usually is dealing against or is working against, these are the same people who blow up abortion clinics, or not even, no, that's the wrong word. It's not abortion clinics. These are health clinics that happen to provide abortions. These are the same people who strap bombs to themselves and explode in a crowded square. These are not people who are going to listen. No, when you say, no, actually you're not looking at your religious text correctly. And there's really not much. You can shame them. You can show how poor the idea is, but you can't have a discussion with them.
We had a Catholic priest on our show, and he stands in front of these health clinics, abortion clinics, and he pleads with people, please, please, don't kill the fetus. Don't do that. And I asked him point blank, because I was going through what he perceived to be true, because he's Catholic. He takes a Catholic modeling, a very synthetic, very failed meta-language, and that's his belief system. And we went through 2 hours of discussion, and he said to me, when I questioned him, he said, if God spoke to me and told me to kill infants, he said that he would. And I'm simply saying, these people are this sick.
Yes,
and I'm
that's
simply
true.
saying they need rational reasons. Your Bible doesn't say this. For instance, to take up for the Jews are laughing at Catholics and Protestants, because Catholics and Protestants have basically carved, if you will, a theology and called it the Old Testament. It is not anything like what the Jews know to be true. The Jews keep moving on because they know that it's nothing more than abstract art. They've never practiced an accuracy model of anything. They're ashamed of what Catholics and Protestants are trying to do, and they're laughing and having a good time in life for the most part. And I just don't know why we can't be a little bit more reasonable concerning this, because I think that in order to get people to recover from religion, I think they need to not deal, if you're going to deal with fallacious beliefs, you have to engage with truth. You know, the truth of mythology, the truth of theology. You know, I think that's what dispels all these fallacious beliefs anyway.
And I'm sorry. I think that we've kind of been asking theists to do the same thing when they try to approach and absolutely dismiss the theory of evolution and point at the Grand Canyon and you know, they're attacking his profession, but they're using the Grand Canyon and, you know, all kinds of evidence or irreducible complexity and intelligent design. We could almost ask the theists the same thing. Why don't you publish something if you want to engage with, you know, Richard Dawkins about, you know, evolution instead of pointing at these unfalsifiable things? Now, that's kind of what it looks like. I don't want to say from our perspective, but it's kind of demeaning his work. So for him to reply in kind and start, you know, talking about the... Okay,
but if history paints this, and as a translator, I have to deal with this, and I want to be very transparent about this. When I started translating, I couldn't just get a hold of manuscripts and look at them. And people need to understand this. It's the church is not honest. It's not going to let you look at the evidence. It won't allow you just to say, oh, I want to do some translating, and so you can do it. It doesn't happen that way. You have to go through more hoops than not just to get access to see different documents. It takes years, and it's a painful process because the church is protecting doctrines. They don't want people examining, for instance, uncial manuscripts and going A to Z with this. They don't want that. None of the publishing companies that are called Christian want to even mess with someone who will actually legitimately question the textual evidence of the church. And so there is a war that I'm fighting, and I'm very much for you guys who refer to yourselves as atheists. But you guys need to understand that in the theistic community, these people, they have set up these strongholds and trying to bust through these things. This isn't something that you can do in 5 to 10 years. It takes years, and it takes lots and lots of people who will get involved in a movement so transformation or some kind of thing will change. And this isn't easy. And so, yes, works need to be published, and we are going to be publishing within 5 years, and we have much to say about this. And so you're very right. Richard Dawkins needs something better to read, and he will have that within about 5 years. But Sarah, we don't want to hold the conversation up any longer tonight. We're completely out of time. But I want you to understand that we're completely for you. The New Covenant group, all of us here, we love you very much. My wife and I do. We respect you, and we would like for you to be a part of the New Covenant group, because this isn't the place for just theists, but it's the place for atheists. It's a place where we can have meaningful conversations and not even have to agree with each other, but we can be kind and be respectful and walk away and support each other.
Exactly. I did want to just speak to just a few seconds ago, and I know we're out of time, but I just wanted to say when interacting with people who have that very fundamentalist viewpoint, it tends to actually be counterproductive in my experience to use logic with them, because they've abandoned all logic to get to their conclusion. So it tends to actually be a little bit more helpful to go a different route and speak to their emotion and to the conflict that they feel, because they all see the disconnect between different things in their theological viewpoint. It's getting them to acknowledge it and to actually hold on to that part instead of dismissing it, that I think gets them along the path of considering other possibilities about their faith. Because kind of what you were saying earlier, it sounded like you were saying if they just could see the logic behind how wrong they are. Well, I think we agree on that point, but they didn't get to where they're at with logic. They obviously abandoned it at some point.
So you're saying that they're like a drug addict or a drunk. You have to detox them and go through certain procedures first before you can rationally speak to them.
I think you have to give them validation and appreciate that their viewpoint is sincere. That's a big one that I work with people on understanding. A lot of times people will bring up Westboro as example. Well, they're nutcases. They don't believe it. They really do. They're very sincere in their belief. And if you start with working with people who have those very ardent viewpoints, then we have to start with where they're at, and the only way to get through to them at that point is with their emotional process, because they literally have put that logic on the shelf. It doesn't matter that it doesn't add up anymore. They've been taught how to ignore that, and I think that's an important thing to remember.
Well, that sounds good. You have been wonderful. And once again, I'm going to ask you to give a little bit of ad here at the end of the show, how people can get a hold of you, because I think we all need recovery from religion, to be honest with you. My wife and I will be your first patients.
Well, thank you. I've had an absolutely delightful time talking with you. This has been a wonderful 2 hours. You can learn more about recovering from religion by going to our website. It's www.recoveringfromreligion.org, exactly like it sounds. Again, I want to plug the Hotline Project. That's going to be a 24/7 staffed 800 toll-free number that people can call who are having any kind of crisis of faith, whether they are religious and looking to move away from that, or whether they're secular or even lifelong atheists and they're just negatively impacted by religion in their life. We want to be there and help those people. We're trying to raise $30,000 by the end of June to be able to launch this project just in time for fall, which is right around the holidays and when everybody starts to really feel the strife of all this religious conflict that they're going through. We want to be there for these people. So definitely go to our website, and we're a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. You can support us and get a tax write-off at the same time, which is a great bonus. And like I said, if you want to start a group or if you're looking for a group, we have all that on there as well. You can always contact us on our form, and we answer as close to every email as possible. So feel free to get a hold of us.
You're doing a great work, and we really applaud you. And so I know tonight we've had so many comments thanking you for what you're doing and admiring you. And we've had comments about Vince, too. Actually, Vince, we've had comments saying the artist is doing a marvelous job. So, and everybody's enjoyed the panelists as well. So we want to thank everybody for being here tonight.
I want them to remember that Michelangelo, how long did it take him to do the Sistine Chapel?
I hope everyone could hear that.
I don't know, 7 years, 17, I don't know. I forget.
I used to know.
I did too. Long time ago.
Well, this has been wonderful. And Sarah, thank you so much for reminding us that we are good enough. We're just fine. And that was one of the most powerful statements that you made all night long. And I hope that gays everywhere will hear this.
Oh, absolutely.
And, I mean, right now they need our support more than ever before. I mean, they really need our support. And so I'd like to thank everyone for being with us tonight, and be with us next Sunday night. And honey, you are gorgeous.
Oh my gosh, here we go again. All right, it's time to cut.
Wow. It's time to go to the house. Okay, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Good night,
was
everybody.
Good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what that was all about at the end there, but what a great show. What a great show this was. Sarah Morehead was fantastic, and Vince Laria, our artist in resident is what we called them when I was in school. Great artists who would come and share their talent with us. He's been fantastic, but I noticed that the first person that he painted was an atheist. And Vince is an atheist, so I'm calling racist on that one. But anyways, we will see you next Wednesday, or this coming Wednesday at 7 o'clock with the Unconventional Pastor and then Dr. Jones to follow. And then we'll be doing this all over again next Sunday from 10 to 10. And I believe Vince will be back with us. Yes, he's shaking his head yes, so fantastic. And we've enjoyed having you, and we hope you've enjoyed it as well. See you then. Love you.